Howdy, Dennis Bradford here. Let's think some about being, feeling, and doing better. What are our egos and how should we relate to them? Please notice that question seems to presuppose that we are not our egos. Are we our egos? To identify only with our egos is to disparage ourselves. Just as we all have a body, we all have an ego. Identifying with only the body or with only the ego is too limited. In fact, if we are the witnessing consciousness, neither body nor ego is essential to what we are. I return to this point in subsequent videos. As suggested in the previous video, let's agree to use ego the way that spiritual teachers use it rather than the way that psychologists use it. Spiritual teachers use many different terms to refer to the ego. These include the self, the egoic mind, the human ego, the dualistic ego, the conditioned mind, the little self, the little mind, the dualistic mind, and so on. If using the word mind seems odd, remember that the mind is just a set of mental contents, such as thoughts, images, sensations, and so on. Since all thoughts use concepts, principles of classification, all thoughts are dualistic. All thinking is discursive. There's always a subject and an object, a this or a that, not an this. This conditioning is an essential limitation of all thought, which is why using mind is not inappropriate in this context. When spiritual teachers don't want to refer to what is limited in this way, they typically use consciousness or awareness. The human ego did not always exist. It exists now. It evolved into existence. Presumably, it evolved along with the evolution of the human brain. Scientists have determined that our human brains did not replace the brains of earlier hominids, but essentially evolved from them by being added to them. This provides a good clue about how we should think of our egos. The purpose of animal brains is to survive and reproduce. Individual and group survival are the biological imperatives. They're the basics. In that sense, survival is the purpose of the ego. The ego is essentially selfish, narcissistic. There's the valuable me, and what is valuable to me, such as my mates and offspring, and everything else that isn't me. The human ego itself is primarily the product and continuation of the presence of the survival core of animal evolution. The ego is primarily the continuation of the animal level of consciousness within the human psyche." End quote. From Dr. Hawkins's Power versus Force. Although our attention can be wholly absorbed by the survival of our bodies, our ability to reason, to think abstractly, and to open to the non-material domain of spirituality allow us to live life very differently from the way that animals have to live. In other words, we're more capable than they are. Recall the importance of choice with respect to the 6 realms of unenlightened existence from the Buddhist tradition. Everyone recognizes this. There's no issue here. It does not entail that we are necessarily more valuable than other animals. The capacity to think, reason, did not replace the mental processes of the animal, but instead was merely added onto it. The animal consciousness is interested only in its own survival, including family and pack, end quote. Dr. Hawkins's emphasis. Having identified our egos, what should we think about them? How should we relate to them? Consider an analogy. Suppose that you have an unwanted emotion, such as anger. You may also notice that you have the tendency to distract yourself from it, to try to ignore it. You may also try to demean or vilify it. We've seen that if you want to be free from bondage to it, that's the wrong reaction. Instead, in effect, accept it fully. Notice it and give it loving, focused attention. That will provide emotional peace. It's similar with the ego. You may think mere survival an unworthy focus of attention. If so, you may try to demean or vilify it. In one respect, that's foolish. It's important to ensure that at least your minimal biological needs are satisfied, or you won't continue to survive. We all need air, water, food, shelter, and protection. In another respect, though, that's noble. You may want to rise above the merely animal level and fulfill your nature as a human being. That desire may cause you to hate your ego. However, hatred is not the way to go. Quote, instead of vilifying the ego, accept it for what it is. The ego is not overcome by condemnation, hatred, and guilt. Rather, one de-energizes it by viewing it objectively for what it truly is. In other words, a vestigial remnant of man's evolutionary origins. The ego is dissolved by benign and non-moralistic acceptance and compassion. End quote. There's nothing wrong with accepting reality. We have bodies. We have emotions. We have egos. I don't know about you, but whenever I fight reality, I lose. Tending to our bodies, meeting our biological needs, taking good care of them, is a good idea. Excessive concern about them, though, is unwarranted. Tending to our emotions, acknowledging them, taking good care of them, is a good idea. Excessive concern about them is unwarranted. What you or I happen to be emotional about is not a big event in the history of the universe. If an emotion is unwanted, simply use the emotional humility method, video 15, the peacefulness process method, video 16, or some similar method to dissolve it completely and go about your business. Acknowledging our egos and respecting them are good ideas. Since they are part of our lives, it would be foolish to pretend otherwise. Why respect them? For the same reason it's a good idea to respect a Komodo dragon or a tiger in the wild. They can hurt you. You may not admire them, but it can be a deadly mistake not to acknowledge or respect them. Instead, keep your distance and try to move away from the danger. Another potentially dangerous mistake would be to feed them. Don't. That's a really good idea with respect to the ego, too. If you feed it unnecessarily, you strengthen it. Instead, the wise weaken it by starving it. They minimize its influence. What does that mean? How is that possible? Let's consider that in the next video. Let's end emotional distress.